Hey guys, so welcome to today's talk. So we're going to be looking at the hermit crab senses and basically how they interact with their environment. Before I begin with this talk, I do want to acknowledge that a lot of the images used are actually from the Crab Street Journal. And any reference images that you may see further on within the talk is from creators that I guess have open sourced their images, and their information will be provided within the images, but I thought I'll briefly mention that before I continue on. So you may notice from today's talk that there's two presenters. So I guess meet the presenters. So first off, we have Kelsey. So they are the brains behind the presentation. So they provided a lot of the info in today's talk. And they've been crabbing since 2016 and have 14 crabs in a 125 gallon beautiful setup. They're the store owner of the Professor Pinchy's Puzzle Emporium, which, if I'm not mistaken, and fingers crossed I'm not, they are one of the vendors in this year's CrabCon. I have had a good couple of late nights, so my brain is currently a bit fried, so I do apologize if that is an incorrect statement I've made. So sorry, Kelsey, if I did make that one incorrect. So I am Jay. You may notice me from previous talks. I have spoken in the past couple of CrabCons, and so I'm basically the mouthpiece of this talk. So I was in charge of putting it all together and I guess presenting to you guys. So as you guys may be aware, I am an Aussie, so I do apologize if I do, I guess, pronounce things differently from you guys across the Great Ocean. Not much we can do about it, so I do apologize now if anything I have pronounced are a bit off the beaten track. So we're going to have a good topic breakdown. So we're going to have 5 main sections. This is just due to the fact that these 5 senses are probably the most well understood, not only of ourselves, but also within crabs. And even then I say well understood with really loose quotation marks, as some have very little evidence compared to others. And all in all, it's a big mess and requires further research, broadly speaking. There is some other senses that do come into play, but Kelsey and myself felt like there was very little evidence and very little research done on them. And in conscious of, I guess, looking and relating it back to us, we're just going to talk about the 5 main senses. And so these 5 main senses, we will be drawing on any known evidence within hermit crabs. If not, we'll be using other crustaceans, both terrestrial and aquatic, to, I guess, further develop our understanding of the senses and how crabs interact with their environment. So first up, we're going to touch on hearing. So I want you to imagine this sound. Think of the beach, waves crashing. This is how we hear it. So how do we do it? So we have our ears. So our ears are responsible for, I guess, collecting and amplifying sound and then processing the sound through electrical signals into our brain. So this is broken up into 3 main sections: the outer, inner, and middle ear, and they're responsible for different things. So our outer ear, this flappy thing, is responsible for kind of channeling all the sounds that we get from our environment. So they kind of act like a funnel and travel through the auditory canal and into our middle ear. So this is separated from our eardrum, which our middle ear is responsible for kind of amplifying any sounds from our environment. So this is done through ossicles. So these are tiny little bones within the eardrum or within the middle ear that's connected to the eardrum, which, as the eardrum moves, leads to the ossicles, I guess, moving as well. It's also interesting to note that the Asterian tube equalizes pressure within the middle and outer ear. So this actually connects to our nose. And so this allows any pressure changes within our environment to equalize from within the eardrum to outside of it. So finally, we've got our inner ear. So this is the cochlea. So this is a snail-shaped organ, which is kind of interesting. It seems like snail shells are like the environmental whoop-de-doo. So hermit crabs love snail shells. We also love snail shell organs. It's just an all-round great tool. So this is actually filled with fluid, and it's actually moves in response to any vibrations from the ossicles, which then, I guess, amplify sound. So this is done through nerves within the fluid matrix that then sends electrical signals from the nerves into our brain, which then our brain processes. So crabs obviously don't have ears. So like, how do they hear this? So as you can imagine, they are capable of detecting sounds. You ask anyone, you hear them chirping. So this is done through crabs making theropod movements against a shell. And so that means that they must be able to detect it, because there's no point in making sounds if you can't detect them. Interestingly, their ears actually their environment, in particular the substrate or the surrounding substrate. So for example, our environment is air. We detect noise through air, through sound waves. They actually use the substrate to detect sounds. So this is done through hair-like receptors on the exoskeleton and within the body. And some of them you can see, like the setae, others not so clearly. So the setae is kind of varied in size, so it can be 20 to 200 micrometers in size. So a lot of the times you may need a microscope in order to actually properly see them. So most of the setae are mechanoreceptive, so that means they respond to movement, but some are capable of chemoreception. So chemoreception means chemical reception, which we will discuss later because it's actually another sense. So changes within their surrounding environment leads to disruption of movement of the setae. And this kind of is like a hybrid structure of our middle and inner ear that we explored earlier. So as things move around, so think of the ossicles, the little bones within our ears, as they vibrate, they lead to amplified sounds, and then they travel to the cochlea, which then kind of sends nerve signals. So the setae kind of amplifies the sound through shaking, and then also sends the nerve signals from receptors straight into the brain. Some aquatic species can sense water vibrations up to 150 hertz, which is kind of pretty impressive when you come and think about it. So their setae responds to water movement rather than hermit crabs, which responds to substrate movement. So the choroidal organ, so this involves receptor cells embedded in muscle, internal projections of the exoskeleton, and connective tissues, and then of course connects to the brain. So some of this can be seen, for example, like this joints in here or in the walking legs. That's kind of like the choroidal organ. In water, they can detect really low frequencies, and in semi-terrestrial species, so for example, the fiddler or ghost crabs, this can detect sounds from their exoskeleton. So as noise kind of travels up into the exoskeleton and within these little, within this organ, they're able to detect some noise. There's kind of no research done on our hermit crabs if they can use this organ to listen or to hear. It wouldn't surprise me if they can use this organ, as it's kind of a universal one within a lot of crustaceans. But of course, further research need to be done on this. So the status is kind of an undetermined one. There's kind of umming within academics regarding if this is capable of noise, if this is capable of detecting noise. And this is found within the crabs. So this is actually found kind of in the head region, along the base segment of each antennae. And so this is kind of like our middle ear. So it's a fluid-filled chamber that is actually, instead of being lined with receptor cells, it's kind of lined with the statoliths and sensory hairs that then vibrate. So instead of sensory cells that, due to fluid vibrations, the sensor cells kind of hear that, they can use their receptor cells are actually little hairs that kind of respond to movement of the fluid. Like I mentioned, there's very little evidence that crabs actually use this organ, so it's kind of an undetermined one at this stage, and it'll be interesting to see down the track of whether they actually use this fluid-filled chamber actually filled with a gelatinous matrix, if they're actually capable of hearing or not. So it's really interesting. So interestingly, and as I mentioned prior, they can use the substrate to hear. So this means that they're able to detect sounds regardless of, I guess, the air. So this you know, when you look at, for example, a ghost crab, they're able to detect sounds up to 10 meters away, which doesn't sound that impressive. But when you think about it, they're able to detect sounds even in extreme windy conditions, which is bizarre because when you come think about it, when we hear, if there's high levels of wind, we can't hear anything. So interspecies communication does occur. So this is common, like, you know, for example, like crabs chirping, they communicate through that. And this communication occurs across a lot of crustacea, particularly within crabs, but does extend to other crustaceans. Obviously, their best recepting sounds occur within the same frequencies as they produce. So think of us, like, we hear sounds that we produce. We don't really hear, for example, really high pitched notes or really low frequencies. We hear sounds that generally we produce, type thing. And that also extends to our hermit crabs as well. So interesting that high frequencies, so 350 plus hertz, was observed in fiddler crabs, and they were unable to hear above 350, which is due to the fact that fiddler crabs use really low frequencies to communicate. So there's no need to, I guess, hear out for high frequencies. So noise pollution is a common problem within a lot of animals within the world. So this actually, there is some evidence to support that it does happen within hermit crabs, or noise pollution is a problem with hermit crabs. And what is noise pollution? So noise pollution is kind of unnecessary human-made, so human constructed noise. So this can be, you know, loud, you know, cars, roads, buildings, general hustle bustle of the city, people talking, planes, things like that, which then leads to negative impacts on animals. And one study within purple pinchers noted that boat noise in conjunction with flashing lights or just really bright lights mask sounds of predators. So in combination of bright lights and flashing, in combination of bright lights and really high levels of sounds, predator lookouts or predator kind of observations, it's the best way to look at it, was decreased. So this meant that their surrounding environment is a great influence of how they hear. A lot of noise then leads to problems of, I guess, them being able to look and hear out. So noise potentially could be a massive influence in wild populations, and I feel like more research does need to be conducted in order to look at the effects of noise done on hermit crabs. So now we're going to move on to sight. And sight, how do we see? So we actually look at light reflecting off objects. So as light reflects off an object and into our eye, that is how we look at through the world. So the cornea acts like a filter to protect the eye, and light then passes through the lens and through a vitreous gel into the back of the eye here, called the retina. So the retina is filled with photoreceptor cells that then from the retina sends electrical signals. So as these receptors get excited, they send electrical signals up through the optic nerve into our brain, which our brain does all the processing. So also important to mention that the sclera also helps with keeping the eye safe. So this helps reduce the chance of infection. Obviously, our eyes are open to the environment, so you want to try to reduce that by looking at ways to minimize it. So the sclera does that. And the iris, so the little black thing within our eye, is capable of growing and constricting, so getting smaller in response to light. So as bright light, you obviously don't need a whole lot of light. You don't want to oversaturate because then you can't see anything. It constricts, and as things get dark, it opens up. So how do crabs see? So we can see this beach and we'd be like, wow, at the beach, great. See the waves, kind of see color. How does it all work? So crabs have what is called a compound eye, which is kind of different from what we have. So compound eyes are kind of multiple little eyes all clustered together to form one big eye. So we just have one big eye. They kind of have compound eyes. So they have what is called a cluster of photoreceptor cells called an omadium. So that's kind of this right here. And this in in the terms of having compound eye, actually increases their visual outlook on their environment. They're able to see a lot more than what we're capable of seeing. So contrast within hermit crabs is actually more critical than brightness. So we tend to be, brightness is more critical than contrast, but in crabs it's reversed. And it's likely just due to the fact that they adapted to low light environments, so crepuscular, so dawn or dusk, or nocturnal environments. Similar to us, they contain 8 retinal cells and they form the basis of the photoreceptors. So eyes, as I briefly touched on, is kind of used to look out for predators and also, you know, partners and things like that. So the eyes are the kind of the window to the world. They use a combination of sensors to keep an eye out on predators, as we mentioned before. Hearing is a major influence, so is our eyes, and potentially also other senses as well. So in particular, eyes and sound seems to be a really big influence on a hermit crab or crab's anti-predator response. And it's also suggested that our land hermit crab eyes function very similar to fiddler crabs. So for example, this image here, the fiddler crabs is this one here, where they have a really, really strong view kind of in the middle. So think of like how it's, you know, the eyes kind of elongated. They have a really strong view in the middle. So this means that they're able to see out and also view kind of their partners type thing. They obviously, their partners are going to be roughly about their eye level. And as the field of view increases, they're actually, the way that they look kind of decreases in terms of visual quality. So by the time you hit almost vertical, all I can see is really shadows and kind of abstract shapes. So this is kind of a predator. Obviously, you don't need to be like, oh, what type of predator it is, or you need to be like, oh, there's a shadow and it's getting bigger. I need to hide. So that's how kind of crabs see. And obviously down low, you're not really that important. Once again, you kind of want to see out. So the way that their field of view works is kind of out, and as you kind of increase or decrease from that, leads to a kind of change in visual quality. So shape is important, like I touched on. So having an overall rounded shape kind of increases viewing angles. So in fiddler crabs, they almost have like a 360-degree view, and that's just due to the way that their eyes are orientated. They're able to see up, out, down, and around, which greatly increases their predatory lookout, so to speak. So eye stalks also increase range. So being elevated, they're able to see a bit more than what would be the eyes are kind of at body level. So in our hermit crabs, they're kind of also able to see above and over the shell. So having eye stalks also allows them to kind of look out a bit more, a bit better. So crabs are extremely sensitive to shapes. So if they see shapes, especially if it increases or decreases in size, crabs will hide. So they respond to their environment through changes in size of objects. So can crabs see color? So the most basic answer is yes. And it really depends on the species. So for example, most crustaceans are dichromates, so that means they can have 2 color receptors. However, some species may be tri, like us, for example, we're trichromates, but some may be tetra, so 4, or polychromates. So polychromates involve the mantis shrimp. So the mantis shrimp, a little fun fact, has up to 16 receptors, excluding their polarized light built in, and also they're able to detect UV as well. And so these 16 receptors, you may go, whoa, like they can able to see a really vast range of colors. And for a long time, scientists also thought that until recently, when they found out that mantis shrimp can almost see as well as we can. And for the longest time, they were puzzled and going, how? They got 16 receptors. And interestingly enough, the way that their eyes operate is a lot different to ours. So for example, our 3 receptors, we're able to blend colors together. So think of like the color wheel. You're able to blend to get shades of like blue to then green to then yellow. Mantis shrimp have blue, then green, and then yellow. And they're unable to kind of blend these colors together. So they have really distinct colors, receptors, and that's it. Many species of crustaceans can actually see within the UV spectrum. And this kind of supports what we've been saying for a long time, where we've noted that an increased activity level and things like that in response to UV light. So when we give UV light, the crabs seem to behave very differently. So they may, and there is evidence to support that they can see UV light. However, further research does need to be conducted on that. And it's likely that our hermit crabs can see indigo, including UV, and it extends to blue/green wavelengths. It's also likely that they can see other wavelengths as well, but these seem to be the most prominent. So in this image here, this is kind of what mantis shrimp see. So on the left-hand side, this is what we see. And then on the right is kind of what mantis shrimp see, looking at through polarized light. So their world is very, very different, or the way that they view their world is very, very different to us, but at the same time, very similar in a weird kaleidoscope of colors. So, of course, as I touched on previously, there's very limited studies done on hermit crabs. Most of the research has been done on the pepper pinchers. So pepper pinchers contain, or most likely contain, dichromatic vision. It's most likely that other species also have dichromatic vision. However, there might be potential that they have tri or tetra or even more. So it'll be interesting to see if any studies are done in the future, what their vision is. Interestingly enough, that blue objects increased likelihood of hiding behaviors within these crabs from one study, and another study found that blue light feeding behavior increased in comparison to having, or when exposed to no light or red light. So the way that blue is a really strong determinant for viewing things and also increasing behaviors is really interesting to know. So maybe just due to the fact that at night, blue wavelengths tend to be a bit more common. So that might just be a determining factor that they have more blue receptors. But who knows? It'll be really interesting to see if any research comes from that. So interesting enough, the predatory shapes, so bird and square shapes, increased chance of escape response within the Ecuadorian crabs. So Ecuadorians don't really hide, they more run away, and that's just due to the fact that they inhibit smaller shells. So their response is instead to hide, to run away. So squares are scary, and so are bird shapes. As I touched on before, that UV spectrum may be applicable to the viewing of crabs, and it's a common trait between a lot of arthropods and also crustaceans. So it's likely that our hermit crabs do see in UV spectra. Of course, there's very little scientific evidence to confirm or deny it. However, there is enough, I guess, overwhelming support that they can see within the UV spectra. So what we do know is that crabs have a really unhealthy obsession with the color blue to a point where they might need to seek therapy or something. Blue increases hiding behaviors, and blue increases feeding behaviors. All around, blue is their love child. Interesting enough that crabs that undergo a change in environment from their larval stages to their adult stages also have different eye structures. So for example, Zoila or Megalopa compared to terrestrial crabs have very different eye structures, and that the aquatic stages are more adapted to, I guess, looking through an aquatic lens compared to terrestrial stages. The semi-terrestrial are more suited to a terrestrial lens. And this is not only just applicable to changes in aquatic to terrestrial, this might also be applicable to changes in the aquatic environment compared to, like, for example, swimming at the surface to swimming deep or to living in deep sea. So it's unknown whether this shift occurs. However, it's likely that it occurs on land. So for example, they first molt into their adult form. But there needs to be research done on it. There's very little research to be done. So it'll be interesting to see in the future what exactly occurs. So our next sense is smell. So the smell is kind of a big deal. So we use our nose to smell. So this is done by receptors called olfactory receptors, which actually tend to be odors specific. So think of, like, for example, if you smell a rose, some receptors are getting excited compared to smelling like dirt, which another receptor will get excited. And to in some smells that use a combination of receptors, all those combinations are also excited, which then, regardless of what's excited and what's not, the excited ones send a signal to the brain, which the brain then processes. So imagine if you could smell this picture. So you've got coconut, the flowers, so imagine it's really coconutty floral scent. We can smell that. So what do the crabs smell? So the crabs actually use what is called their antennae. So their antennae kind of form their nose. It is really heavily entwined with taste, which we'll discuss later, which is kind of superficially similar to us. One of the strongest senses is their smell, which they use to, I guess, locate food, water, and even shells. So smell is a big important thing in the environment. So the antennae contain structure called ethesiostats, which very similar to our nose chemical receptors. They are chemical receptors as well, and they start the pathway from, I guess, receptor to the brain. So they're very similar to insects, and this is particularly true with terrestrials, more terrestrial adapted species of crab compared to aquatic crustaceans. So it's really interesting that, I guess, the adaptations that hermit crabs have utilized in order to live on land. Long distance detection occurs within the distal radius called the flagellum. So this is kind of this bad boy down here. So this allows long range sense. So this is why they kind of wave it in the air so they can detect long ranges. And it's kind of, if people are familiar with molting, these the antennas are renewed within each molt. So for those that may be familiar with molting, it may not be new news. For others that might not be, they use kind of reuse, they renew the antennas within each molt. So interestingly enough, moisture is important. So even though crabs are adapted to land, that doesn't mean that they don't require water. So odors that are really, really, I guess, water soluble or have a water-like base content are really, really interesting to the crabs. They have a lot of sensors adapted to these molecules. So these can be either attractants or repulsants. So these can be like bad water-based solubles, or they can be good. And crabs have a really strong affinity to these through their receptors. So this may suggest that they, really require a humid environment, or humid environments may increase their smell response. So it's interesting to note that humidity may play a role not only in their body function, but also their senses too. So close proximity to the ethesiostats is their epidermal glands, which they're not responsible for smell, but they're responsible for the function of smell. I guess that's the best way to put it. So these are modified tegumental glands. So tegumental glands are found in aquatic species. Their epidermal glands are found in terrestrial species. And they produce a mucus which then covers their antennae. So if you ever notice that the antennae are kind of like a really waxy, shiny layer, you now know why. It's this little mucus which actually helps reduce moisture loss. So even if they're not in a high humid environment, they use this mucus in order to protect their antennae from the environment. So indirectly, this is also used as a way to minimize microbial invasion. So think of it like the mucus that we produce in our nose. It helps decrease the amount of dirt and bacteria that we get. And so this mucus layer is also very similar to us as well. So you can kind of see this here, in this little image here, which then if you zoom out is kind of around the ethesiostats. So interesting enough that odor detection may be species specific. So for example, each individual hermit crab species, land hermit crab species, may have very different odor receptors and detectors, and maybe have strong affinity to some compared to others. So in terrestrial crustaceans versus aquatic, terrestrial species have a really, really strong affinity to water detection. So not only just water detection, but also salinity. So they're able to detect between freshwater and saltwater. So think of it in the land, you're more prone to desiccation. So you want to be able to detect water. So that's the reason why water detection is so strong in terrestrial species compared to aquatic. Also, where they found, so inland species tend to have a really strong affinity compared to coastal species. So another example is like the Indonesian crab compared to the strawberry crab. The strawberry crab's more found closer to the ocean, so they have a really weaker affinity, at least compared to the Indonesians, which have a really strong water affinity. And a lot of the time, the olfactory system, so the smell system, is closer in function and behavior to insects like Drosophila, so fruit fly, compared to other crustaceans. So it's really interesting how terrestrial adaptations have led to, I guess, really drastic changes to aquatic versus terrestrial environments. So aquatic and land smells also do differ. So for example, in water, you have a lot of water-based, water-soluble based compounds compared to on land, which may not be as water-soluble. So this means that aquatic environments may have different, or most likely will have different smells. And it'll be interesting to note if aquatic stages of our land hermit crabs do have different chemical receptors, or they have, even if they may have these chemical receptors into adults, if there's a change in the abundance or the relative amount, the ratio of chemical receptors from when they're juvenile, so they're more likely to have water-based receptors compared to when they're adult, where they lose them and they've developed other chemical receptors in response to their environment. So it'd be really interesting if any further research comes out from this. So the hermit crab's nose is kind of really interesting because they're really, really attracted to smells. So smell plays a great role in not only what they eat. So a commonly cited article within the crab community noted that they have preference for food that they haven't eaten recently. So this extends up to about 6 hours. And the academics theorize that this leads to broad diets. So if they don't have foods, or if they have different smelling foods, it increases the amount of nutrients that they will get. So crabs use this as a mechanism to make sure they're getting a varied diet. And interestingly enough, the same researchers compare growth rates of hermit crabs when they fed on a single item diet compared to a mixed diet. And they found that growth rate increased when they were offered a plethora of foods compared to crabs that only had a single food-based diet. Interestingly enough, that dead individuals also play a critical role in their smell. So crabs are more likely to source out and hunt out a carcass or a dead crab smell compared to if they have food-related smells. And this is just due to the fact that a dead crab normally signifies if there's any shell there. So a shell means a potential new home. So a dead crab means a potential new home for the hermit crab to take it over. So they tend to be really, really attracted to dead smelling crabs because they can get shells. So shells is the limited resource, so they use this as a way to minimize that. So what can they smell? So it's possible that they're able to detect things like water salinity, so freshwater to saltwater. They may also be able to look at changes in humidity as well. However, most of the there's very little evidence on this, and most of it is kind of speculation from academics. At this point in time, they do know that they can detect water-based smells, and of course, or water-soluble smells, and they can also detect other smells due to the chemoreceptors. But the chemoreceptors form kind of detection of smells and also water as well. So it's really like, it's smell, but not really, but it's akin to it. It's really interesting in how they behave. So the way that land hermit crabs kind of overcome this is they have a really, really strong, I guess, chemoreceptors within their antennae, which they use to smell, among other things. So taste. So we use our tongues to taste. So this is a combination of different receptors. So, for example, sweet receptors will be different from like salty receptors on our tongues. This is done by they bind to a particular molecule within our food, which then causes proteins within the cell of the receptor to change as these proteins cell wall change. As the proteins within the cell wall do change, they activate nerve cells surrounding these cells. So proteins change in the receptors of our tongue leads to neural cells, then sending up an electrical signal to the brain. And basically, these little indentations along the tongue kind of collect the food for us. So even if it has a really small concentration or amount of food, these little indentations kind of help trap the food and give us the best amount of taste. So, of course, taste is kind of directly linked to smell. Without smell, we cannot taste. So if you were to taste this image, imagine coconutty flavor, yummy. How do they taste? So crabs also use their mouth, similar to us, but they also have this extra thing called the dactyls. So this is a final segment on limbs, for example, like their claws or their legs. And these dactyls contain hairs, so the setae, that is responsible for taste. So these are the chemical receptors that I mentioned previously. In ghost crabs, they kind of function as a nose as well as a taste, as well. So, like I've said previously, smell and taste are really heavily intertwined within crustaceans. And antennae are also used as chemoreceptors as well. So they're also capable of some form of rudimentary taste as well. So intertidal species of crabs will avoid food if they cause illness. For example, one study noted that, I guess, exposing them to novel food like beef, then if they injected the crab with lithium bromide kind of caused illness within the crabs. They noted that they will not eat beef afterwards. So even though they ate the food maybe once, if they ever were exposed to beef again after being injected with lithium bromide, they were less likely to eat it. So they showed food avoidance. So it's likely that either smell, taste, or a combination of both, as they are really heavily interrelated, played a massive role in food avoidance. So it'd be interesting to know if hermit crabs also have this mechanism. It's likely that they do. And it just really is interesting that smell and taste, how heavily intertwined they are within our hermit crabs. It's very similar to us, but it's kind of almost exacerbated within hermit crabs. So touch. As I mentioned prior, how we touch is kind of, through receptors again. Receptors is a common trait, as you can imagine. So nerves adjacent to receptors send an electrical signal. So as our receptors kind of get excited from, I guess, pressure, it sends an electrical signal to our brain. So that's how we respond to touch. And of course, some regions are a bit more sensitive. For like example, our lips and our fingers are very sensitive. So in a small amount of area, contain a lot more receptors compared to, for example, the back of our hands or like our skin here, which is not as sensitive. Other receptors that are very similar to touch, and it is a form of touch, is the nociceptive receptors, which respond to pain. So this is done through actually cell damage surrounding these receptors. As the cells are damaged, then they release a signal to the brain and be like, oh, this is pain, this is bad. So how do the crabs touch? So they actually use their setae. So their setae, as I mentioned before, not only is it a mechanoreceptor, but also kind of allows them to not only hear, but also to touch. So as their setae kind of touches something, it kind of sends movement with that, and that's how the crabs feel it. They're kind of like their receptor is their setae. So their antennae also form as a touch receptor. So their setae also is capable of touch as well. They also are capable of feeling that because they have receptors on that. And a desert isopod species actually use the sensory current on the tip of their antennae to not only touch, but also chemical perception, so smell, and also a form of taste. So it's really heavily intertwined, touch, smell, and taste within crustaceans. So touch, taste, smell, hearing, they're all really heavily intertwined within crustaceans. A lot of the research done is currently, at best, a rudimentary understanding, particularly within hermit crabs, but also extends to other crustaceans. A lot of the sensory organs, for example, the setae is responsible for not only hearing, touch, taste, and things like that. And the antennae are really, really extremely important to a lot of these senses and play a massive role in the way that crabs, I guess, see and also feel and taste, touch, whatever their surrounding environment. There is other kind of senses that we have not covered in this talk, and I do want to give a brief nod to them, that are well likely to occur. So for example, pain, I briefly touched upon that, but there is some suggestion that crustaceans may be able to sense an electric or magnetic field, or proprioception, which is another sense as well. Unfortunately, this is really poorly understood, so it'd be interesting to see if anything does come out from the future. So thanks, guys, and enjoy CrabCon. And I hope you found this really informative. Bye for now.